So welcome to another series in the Liberty series. This one is going to be based on this book here that I bought a few years ago, and it's all about English paper piecing. Now this is a Dutch woman, William Hammerstein, who is really interesting woman. She born in Holland. Her mum was very creative, so she grew up being surrounded by sewing. She sewed at school. When she left school, she loved to sew all her own clothes, and so when she then trained to be a lawyer, she would be travelling to courts and meetings and so on trains and hanging around in waiting rooms in courts, and she would make little tiny bits of patchwork that she then pieced together in the evenings. So this book then is firstly, it's written in French, but fortunately for me in English as well, and it's several different amazing tessellated quilt patterns, beautifully explained with layouts and so on. But the one that I want to talk about is this one, which is, I mean, it's just unbelievable how complicated and intricate it is. Now, a few years ago, these were all over Instagram. It's called La Pascalia. And people were making blocks like this and parts of blocks, cushions and big quilts as well. And I would follow them on Instagram. And I got really interested in them, so much so that I bought the book. So this then is the description of how to make, in French and fortunately in English, how to make these little separate quilt blocks. Now it's all English paper pieced. So, you know, that's what I like to do anyway. But what I love about it is that the Liberty patterns and designs lend themselves absolutely brilliantly to this kind of pattern. So I'll show you what I made. So that was one of the ones that I made. I realised when I'd completed this with these are the papers that I cut out very accurately, and this is the selecting the designs in a very particular way so that you make a secondary design with the Liberty fabric. But I realised when I got to the end of making this that I didn't want to make a quilt out of this. I just didn't. So this is one of the little mandalas. I made this one as well, which I'll just move the one out from underneath. And this one, it shows beautifully how one little element like that can create a really lovely pattern when it's all sewn together. And then this is the peacock feathers here around the outside from the design called Hera. And then I made this little one as well. And these, of course, aren't finished. I could carry on and make more of these if I wanted to. But by the time I'd done these three little mandalas, I'd got to the realisation that actually I don't want to carry on and make a full quilt of these. And I'll tell you what it was that was the death knell of this for me. It was this shape, this tiny little triangle. It's absolutely minute. Let me show you how big the paper piece is. That's how big the paper piece is. And if you look at the design, it's in this dark green, and it makes a star when they all come together. You can perhaps see the star. Can you see the star here? There, in that one there. But I got to the point where I thought, I can't do this. It's driving me round the bend. But I'd really enjoyed doing it to that point. And so I loved doing it, but I knew that it wasn't going to be something that I wanted to carry on and do. Now, I'll explain to you then how the construction of this works. Now, this woman amazingly wrote this book and made this quilt. And then you can buy kits of the paper pieces where all the pieces have been accurately die cut for you, so that you can have them all ready to go, ready to use on your project. But you can also buy, which is what I did because I cut these myself, you can also buy these. So I went online and I found in Australia a company called Sunset Seams, and she laser cuts the pieces. You can't see it against the green mat very well, can you? Let me get something. Here's some white paper. Let's see if that will work. That's better. So these laser cut perspex pieces here, which I bought from, as I say, from Sunset Seams in Australia. So the way that these work is you have the shape that is needed for the piece. Let's see, where does that one go? That one's there. So that piece there is that one. But you also have a border so that when you're cutting your fabric, you can line it up with the piece that you want to use. I've chosen green again, it's not very easy to see. See if it's easier on this yellow. Okay, let's imagine we're going to be cutting out a piece from this yellow fabric. And I could place it really carefully so that I would get the right sort of image I wanted. Liberty lends itself to this absolutely beautifully. It really does. And so once I had all the template pieces, they're beautifully cut, very, very accurate indeed. Then I started to specially select Liberty fabric that had the kind of designs I needed. So this one, for instance, which is a beautiful Liberty fabric, but it's got these little elements in it here. And so if you're making that piece there, you could isolate that and cut that out of the fabric so that it would make the piece you needed. And then you would end up with a little pack like this. So those are the 5-sided pieces, those are the little diamonds. So you see, don't you, that you end up with a piece of paper piecing that has got that little design centered there. And so these were all my spare bits here from making these. There's another one where you can see that the design, when it's put together with another one just like it, would make this amazing secondary design. So this, I have all these pieces still. There's another from that lovely purpley fabric, and there's another of the hero, but in pink this time. So that one is, it's that piece. And so if you were to place them all the way around like so, you would make a secondary design. It's mad, completely mad. And once I realised I wasn't going to do this, I was quite content just to have this one and the other two there, just to have on my wall as beautiful things. So they're unfinished, and they always will be unfinished, but the Liberty fabric works perfectly. Now, if you look at the back of this and we look at the stitches, these tiny, tiny little stitches, I'll tell you when I did this. I did this at a time when I was working on a project that I've written about, in fact, in this book. I wrote this book, which is called Quilt Block Therapy. It's over there in the shop. And it's a project that I did a few years ago at the same time as I discovered this method of working. And I was working in a place where I needed to, I had a lunch break that was an hour and a half long. And, you know, after you've eaten your sandwiches and your banana, you know, that takes 5 minutes. And then you've got the rest of the time to kill. So I would take these little component parts in with me and a needle and thread. And I sat and stitched all of these tiny, tiny, tiny little seams in my lunch break. So when I look at this now, it reminds me of that project, which was actually quite a project. And yeah, it's done now, it's finished, it's not something I want to do again. The other thing, it's very wasteful of Liberty fabric, which is a shame, because it's pretty expensive stuff, as I think I've described to you. And when you're cutting this out, you end up with the rest of the fabric looks a bit like Swiss cheese. And so that was quite wasteful, which is why probably I've got quite a lot of tiny little scraps of Liberty. But hey, that's I wanted to tell you about. The story, this woman's story is lovely. In the beginning of it, there she is. Let's have a look at her. She looks great, doesn't she? And they're like women the world over, surrounded by all her fabrics and bits and pieces. What a remarkable woman. So there you are. There's a very, very complicated bit of English paper piecing that I did try out once, all based on this woman's fantastic book. I'm sure you could get hold of this if you were really interested in doing this kind of work. She sounds like quite an amazing woman. Okay, so next time we get together to do some talking about Liberty, I'll find something else to tell you about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I'm going to read the introduction from the book for you. I was born on August 11th, 1943 at Hilversum in the Netherlands. 2 younger sisters would follow. My family was a traditional one of post-war labourers. My father worked and studied diligently, and my mother looked after the home. As was custom at the time, my mother did a great deal of sewing. She sewed our clothing, knitted warm sweaters and underclothes, embroidered tablecloths, and crocheted pot holders and bed coverings. Thus, when I was very young, I was taught to work with yarn and thread and fabric. At primary school, strict nuns gave sewing classes several times a week, and I learned very much there. After secondary school, I studied law at Utrecht. It was a wonderful time. Outside of class, I was active in community life and was a tourist guide in Italy in the summer. I loved the many parties for which I sewed beautiful dresses. In 1969, I began my law career at Radboud University in Nijmegen. I enjoyed training thousands of students in civil law. I met my colleague Fred Hammerstein there, and we were married in 1974. Our daughters, Friedrich and Vriel, were born in 1975 and 1977. I think that might be Verlee. I've said her name wrong. Their childish drawings and their touching little error-filled letters gave me an idea to embroider them and incorporate them into quilts. One example is the quilt from my inaugural address in 1988 when I was named University Professor of Personal and Family Law. A new world was opened up to me when I visited a quilt exposition at the Arnhem Open Air Museum. I made my first quilt using the English method. Friedrich and Verlee folded the fabrics with paper clips on the templates, and I sewed the pieces together. We had such fun. After I took my first course at Marie Southmont-Moo, I attended others in the Netherlands and other countries. My pronunciation's not great, is it? Sorry. My visits to quilt shows, markets and stores were enriching experiences for me. The closets filled with books, magazines, fabrics, and my head filled with ideas. Fred always brought something to read with him when we went out together, just in case. I was bitten by the quilt bug, and this malady remains incurable. In 1994, I was appointed member of the Council of State at The Hague. This meant many trips between Arnhem and The Hague and much reading to prepare for hearings and meetings. In the evenings, I found rest and time to reflect, making quilts and doing embroidery. At that time, I had an idea of making quilts with men's ties. Family and friends gave me bags of ties and the stories that went with them. Finally, I made 8 large quilts that were exhibited for years in the small white palace of the Council of State. Although I took the National Art Quilt course, I preferred to make traditional quilts, using antique patterns for inspiration. I try to add a personal touch by means of my colour and fabric choices. I'm particularly interested in fabrics that have a history, for example, printed calicos, Dutch scarves, Indonesian batiks, Provençal fabrics, and the remnants of ancient Japanese silk kimonos. My greatest pleasure is to choose the patterns and fabrics, to cut the fabrics and sew the little pieces together. I can pass many hours in my studio in the attic with classical music playing in the background and a profusion of books and fabric all around me. Sometimes inspiration comes from an unexpected perspective. For example, the mathematical figures of the mathematicians Mr. Penrose, or the geometric patterns of Islamic culture. The possibilities for discovering in these sources a pattern that can be translated into a quilt are limitless. I always have several quilts in progress. I make a small piece of each one and put these pieces in baskets on my table with the chosen fabrics. In the evening, I choose from one of the baskets, and thus each sample becomes a large quilt. To make a quilt while lacking enthusiasm just for the sake of finishing it does not suit me at all. I always compare this method of working with preparing a good meal. Doing what pleases makes the finished product more satisfying. I find the sewing machine a necessary evil, and in fact, I use it only for the quilt border. Another very pleasant aspect of this hobby is the possibility of frequent travel. With several friends, we have been to North America and have visited many European cities. The annual trip to France with Trudy Waskin is always a great celebration. My trip to Japan in 2005 with my daughters and my son-in-law for a quilt show was very special. The quilts were unsurpassed in their sophistication, precision and originality. Fred looked after our little grandson, aged 1.5 years, for that week, and for me that was true proof of love. Our quilt group meets once a month. We admire and critique each other's work, help find solutions to problems that arise, and chat amicably about the highs and lows of our daily life. At the age of 67, I retired after a career of almost 42 years as a jurist. I've never experienced the well-known black hole. The days pass quickly. With sports to stay in shape, a French course, our grandchildren, Bella and Amy, live in France, and of course making quilts and embroidering, and giving courses in these subjects. It is very pleasant to share one's hobby with others, to let them know the many creative possibilities, and to forge agreeable ties with those who cross one's path. I would like to continue to enjoy this second life for much longer and in good health with those I love, and to make many, many quilts and stitchery projects. There you are. I enjoyed reading that. I thought you might enjoy hearing it too. See you next time.